This is the first, and we are totally honored to have May Berenbaum as our first speaker. Yes, everybody knows May. She's famous. She's famous because she's a great scientist. But who am I to say? I'm a teacher, and besides, I should put this up, but it's a picture I just printed out of May getting the National Science Medal from Barack Obama about 3 years ago around this time. Oh yeah, put it on up. Obviously the science community, as well as the president, then President of the United States, acknowledged May's expertise in science. And I can say as a teacher, May is a great teacher, not because I've been in her classes, but because every time I talk to May, I feel inspired and that there's something we can do. If we could just help May, help the bees, we're doing something good. And that's always been the case. And so I feel grateful and happy that we have May Berenbaum here to talk to us. Thank you, May.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Misty has been very helpful to me in setting up a citizen science project called Bee Spotter and helping in other kinds of other ways to kind of popularize science and get more people involved in STEM and make it more fun. And that's what today is about. And I know this will fit into the 45-minute time slot remaining, but let me preface this by saying I taught 2 semesters on biology of science fiction films, so this could go on and on and on. But I'm trying to sort of catch the high points here. And I'll do that.
Oh, it's not working. It's not advancing.
Michael?
Click on the window. There we go.
What did you do?
I just tapped it.
Oh.
Mouse tap.
Well, how do I go back? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, now they're working.
All right. Okay. Right. Technology. So science and science fiction would seem almost like polar opposites. In fact, the literal definition of science from the Latin scientia means knowledge. And cinema is from kinema, meaning movement, and it's an art that's based on visualizing the unknown. So we have known versus unknown. But it turns out that science fiction and science are very complementary. So because science advances yield new insights, new knowledge, but also challenges to established worldviews and also concerns about unanticipated consequences, which are not yet real. So this dichotomy provides a rich source of inspiration and potential storylines for science fiction writers who are unconstrained by reality imposed by existing knowledge. So they can visualize the unknown. And science fiction is a genre that emphasizes actual and extrapolative and or speculative science, as well as the empirical method, and can embed that science in a social context. Movies are an ideal medium for visualizing the unseeable, the unseen, that hasn't happened yet, in the context of real knowledge. And scientists themselves provide the scenarios because most forms of new technology are developed in the context of anticipating unanticipatable consequences. These unanticipated consequences are inherently dramatic. So worst case scenarios are box office gold. They have drama, they have tension. And it's always important to remember, if you want to use science fiction for teaching, that the film industry is aimed at providing entertainment. That's their #1 goal. Scientific reality can be useful, but it's the first thing that's jettisoned if it interferes with the story. So the #1 priority is the story. In fact, as movie mogul Sam Goldwyn said, pictures are for entertainment, messages should be delivered by Western Union. So in terms of the pedagogy of using science fiction and movies in teaching, there are affective attributes that encourage engagement in science. This is part of pedagogical theory. Stockelmeyer and Rennie identified entertainment as one of these affective attributes. And movie watching has as its ultimate goal and purpose for existence being enjoyable and entertaining. Attributes that relate to learning science include strongly emphasizing narrative, because according to Stockelmeyer and Rennie, narratives engage learners, particularly if they encourage personal meaning making. Movie narratives that are the central focus of films thereby provide a framework for engagement. Another attribute to learning science listed by Stockelmeyer and Rennie, presenting science which is simply explained, jargon-free, and in the active voice, presenting science as a story using analogies, and that enhances learning. So just to illustrate the importance of jargon-free communication, you see in the two columns mortality factors of movie arthropods in the 1950s and actual arthropods in the 1950s. So in the movies, guns, electricity, fire, atom bombs, and reversing the polarity, that actually was in a movie. Easy, graspable terms, instantly relatable. What was actually being used by the late 50s to control insects? Paradichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, pheromones, Bacillus thuringiensis, verbenone, which is also 4,6-trimethylbicycloheptene-2-one, or integrative pest management. None of these is a user-friendly term, and it's very difficult to relate to. So jargon can get in the way of a story. Another reason it's useful to tap into movies, they can reach people, they can affect people. And in fact, a 2016 Redbox study showed that Americans watch on average a total of 5,000 movies during their lifetime, and see all or part of at least 84 movies on average during a typical year on a variety of platforms. And that has, there's virtually inexhaustible diversity, and that can be useful in view of the fact that 41% of the respondents in their survey said that a movie changed the way they see the world, and 10% said that the movie influenced their career path. Adam Rutherford, one of Britain's best-known geneticists, was in fact remarkably inspired by Ghostbusters. So beyond the frequency with which Americans watch movies, the diversity of scientific subjects that are depicted in films again provides limitless opportunities for sharing knowledge with interested and motivated students across a broad swath of science. These are the 25 all-time top movies based on cumulative domestic box office, just USA, and 80% of them have explicit science content. They're among the most popular of all movies in the USA. Disciplines represented include cybernetics, ecology and anthropology and Avatar, glaciology and engineering and Titanic, paleontology and genomics in all of the Jurassic movies, physics, astrophysics, and exobiology in all the Star Wars movies, to arachnology and physics in Spider-Man and all of the Spider-Man movies. So a diversity of science disciplines to tap into. And it turns out, one in particular that's quite amenable to teaching through movies is genetics, genetics and related science discipline, evolution. And genetics and cinema actually grew up together. They emerged in the late 19th century in the same time, and they have intertwined ever since their first appearance. So in the second half of the 19th century, attracting an enormous amount of public attention was the concept of evolution. Darwin proposes origin of the theory of evolution based on natural selection in 1859. Thomas Henry Huxley, in a series of very public lectures, defended the theory against Bishop Wilberforce. And at the same time, the discovery of fossils and reinterpretation of their meaning led to what are called the Great Bone Wars of 1877 and 92, where there were paleontologists dueling for fossils and capturing the public imagination. So that's what was going on in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. At the same time, photography was developing in a way that would lead to cinema. Edward Muybridge was a photographer who had an interest in animal locomotion, and he developed a system for using stop-motion photography with his multiple cameras set at different places in order to capture motion that the human eye can perceive but not break down into individual images to catch every motion because of what's called flicker fusion frequency. We can't differentiate what made individual images. In 1878, Leland Stanford, for whom Stanford University is named, he was a railroad magnate, made a bet and wanted to be right. So as wealthy people do all the time, he hired somebody, Muybridge, to see if he could take photographs to prove him right. And the bet was about whether horses, when they gallop, ever have all 4 feet off the ground at the same time. Well, the initial bet was trotting, then it moved on to galloping. And Muybridge brilliantly deployed his method, which he'd partnered with a projection system and a device he called the zoopraxiscope, and showed incontrovertibly that there's always one hoof on the ground. Lost the bet, but then the world gained essentially the concept for movies. Science actually gained new tools as well, building on Muybridge. The French physiologist Jules Marais perfected devices for measuring movement in animal locomotion. And he developed a kymograph, which was a rubber capsule, which was connected by a rubber pipe to a paper on a recording device with a moving needle so that air vibrations would be recorded, and he could that way break down wing beats of birds and bees and leg movements of people and horses. When he heard about Muybridge's work, he thought better than a moving needle is just to use a photographic plate. So he created this rotating photographic class plate to create what he called a photographic gun that could shoot 12 photos per second. So we're heading toward, through science, this was a scientist who helped invent movies. Thomas Edison is best known for actually taking that next step, inventing the kinetoscope and popularizing movies for the general public as entertainment rather than for scientific investigation. Thus, cinema was born. Oh gosh, what happened here? Right. And it wasn't long before the first science fiction film appeared. And that was Le Voyage dans la Lune, or The Trip to the Moon, From the Earth to the Moon. This was a 12-minute silent short that was written and directed by Georges Méliès, who invented all kinds of trick photography to depict the unseen and unknowable. And some people say that's when science fiction films were born. And this cross-fertilization between science and entertainment through cinema continued throughout the early years of the 20th century. Emil Cohn was an entertainer who was nonetheless interested in the unseen or the difficult to see, and he produced a film called The Happy Microbes, Les Joyeux Microbes, where he could, again, combining science into, it's not science fiction, but it's really based in science fact, with a little bit of imagination there. That yes, there are microscopic organisms. No, they do not wear top hats and dance. Similarly, Ladislav Starevich was a would-be documentary filmmaker in Poland who was frustrated by his efforts to capture the mating behavior, courtship behavior of stag beetles on film. The film at the time to shoot a film, you needed high energy lights and close up, and the insects immediately stopped behaving, and he couldn't get them to engage in their agonistic ritual and displays. So he killed them, dissected them, and wired them up again, and then moved them himself. And in that way, he invented stop motion, or he invented puppet animation, which very soon he transitioned over to entertainment. Much more money in making movies. This is called Revenge of the Kinematograph Cameraman. It's a charming film about an insect-sordid love affair with a nightclub dancer. More people, and that's true today, will go see a sordid romance than we'll go see a movie about courtship behavior of stag beetles. So at the same time, late 19th century, genetics as a discipline was enabled by greater power to visualize what had been unseeable. So in 1882, Walter Fleming was the first person to observe mitosis, cell division. So when cells divide, they take their heritable information with them. So he noticed salamander embryos developing under the microscope and saw this tangled mass of threads in the nucleus doubling and splitting, which was the first indication that maybe that's how the information got conveyed from one generation to the next. He called it mitosis, from mitos meaning thread. And it was Thomas Hunt Morgan, working with fruit flies, Drosophila melanogaster, in Columbia University, who was the first to show that the heritable material was part of the chromosomes. Now, gene was a word that was only invented in 1909, but people knew about mutations long before that. The word it dates back to the 13th century from the French word meaning changing, and its genetic sense goes back only to 1894. So a mutation is a spontaneous change in a heritable trait that goes from one generation to another. Farmers have long known and taken advantage of mutations. Animal breeders, Ancon sheep, for example. These are sheep with really stubby legs descended from a single lamb, and it was an enterprising sheep rancher in 1791 who figured out that these short, crooked-legged sheep couldn't jump fences very well, which was a big advantage if you were keeping sheep. And it bred, and then continued to perpetuate this mutation for several generations, creating a new breed. Now, the idea that mutations were the stuff of which evolution is made was first proposed by Hugo de Vries. So he did not coin the word, but he was the first to apply it to the concept of evolution. And he was studying with evening primrose, and he speculated that an accumulation of mutations is what led to new species. So he was fully aware of the origin of species and the theory of natural selection. There was no mechanism known that worked really in Darwin's time. So de Vries introduced this concept of mutation. Morgan, working at Columbia on fruit flies, one reason they were, well, a couple of reasons they're useful for studying evolution is they have a very fast generation time, a couple of weeks. You can feed them on rotten bananas. You can get large population sizes. It's important if you're looking for rare traits, because if you were studying 1,000 ponies, they wouldn't fit on one laboratory shelf. But most important for studying evolution, they had fruit flies typically manifest many different kinds of mutations in the phenotype and what's visible, what you can see. There are twisted wings, there are missing wings, there are red eyes, white eyes, there are hairy bodies, bodies that are devoid of hair. So visible mutations that could be seen, often unaided by magnification, which lets you track the heritable traits. And he showed with the white eye mutation that, which is a sex-linked trait, that those mutations are associated with chromosomes. Because white eye is a sex-linked trait. It only shows up in one sex. And this, the sex determination is by chromosome. Therefore, mutations are on the chromosomes. Okay? And it was Hermann Muller in 1927 who was the first person to deliberately create mutations. And he did that by X-ray. And that led to sort of a transformation of the study of genetics, also a Nobel Prize for him. And he sort of laid down the rules for radiation-induced mutation, frequency mutations, chromosomal radiation, chromosomal rearrangement in relation to radiation dose. And then there followed over the ensuing decades the central dogma of biology, which would be a whole another lecture. Genetics and evolution. So 1927 is happening in the 20s. The Scopes trial is happening in the 20s. Dinosaurs are completely, the public is enthralled with dinosaurs. These are museum scenes painted by Charles Knight and visited by millions. And you didn't even have to leave your home to see the unseeable, the long extinct dinosaurs. Winsor McCay was an animator who invented line drawing animation and toured theaters with a combination of personal presentation and an animated dinosaur named Gertie on the same screen. People loved dinosaurs, and people were uncertain about evolution. And there were now movies about evolution because, again, this is a process that theoretically takes millions of years. Cinema can let you can let you visualize it in a short period of time. So it's really cinema really provided an outstanding way to illustrate the concepts of evolution that would otherwise not be particularly graspable. And so the Fleischer movie on Darwin's theory of evolution, the Fleischer studio at the same time was making movies about Betty Boop. So. Then came Willis OBrien, who was a genius in special effects, fascinated by dinosaurs. He was the one who perfected special effects so that you could recreate not just one dinosaur, but an entire prehistoric world. So you probably know he was working on this for years. His most famous work was King Kong, but he continued working well into the 50s. But he could bring to life an entire lost world. King Kong wasn't about mutations, but cinema provided a really great opportunity for filmmakers to translate the anxieties about unanticipated consequences into stories. So Mutation, a great example of how science fiction films can be used to teach science, not just entertain. Because usually, even in the most ridiculous movies, this is Monster from Green Hell, there's a needle of reality that you can dig out of that haystack of imagination. Just a sampling of some of, even today we have mutation movies. Okay. Now, it has long been abundantly clear to the scientific community that irrespective of whether they're generated by X-rays or chemicals or ultraviolet light or any other mutagenic force, mutations are deleterious. The vast majority do not enhance survival. This is Muller from his Nobel lecture. The great majority of the changes should be harmful in their effects, just as any alterations made blindly in a complicated apparatus are usually detrimental to its proper functioning. Many of the larger changes should even be totally incompatible with the functioning of the whole, or as we should say, lethal. Okay. This speech was given in 1946. Do you remember what happened not long before that? There were atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led to enormous anxiety. This was the beginning of the atomic age. And here's Muller saying, yeah, people are affected by radiation, and yeah, mutations are harmful. So this is a Time magazine coverage of the Nobel Prize. Level of radiation will rise. People near the plants will get more gamma rays through their gonads. Possible result, more redheaded children will be born in black-haired families. Curse of the ginger. More mutations will lurk in the germplasm to scandalize future neighbors. So this was called the gloomy Nobel man. And his reassurance was that mutations are typically rare. But the reality is atomic radiation does, in fact, as Muller lead to mutations. And this anxiety was manifested initially in documentaries, which were here wildly inaccurate and sort of sensationalized. This is the film showing testing in the Pacific in the American Southwest, showing survival is possible in a nuclear, in the event of an atomic attack. But remember what the Nobel laureate said is, you can survive, but horrible consequences may accompany that survival. And people knew about how deleterious mutations. This is a fruit fly. Remember all these phenotypic mutations that you can easily visualize. Among the more dramatic are these homeobox mutations, homeotic mutations that affect development, where there's a gene that encodes a transcription factor in charge of turning off or on other genes. So entire appendages can be affected by a gene and a transcription factor. And there are two of these homeotic mutations, proboscipedia and antennapedia, where a body part becomes a leg that shouldn't be. And here's here's antennapedia, where instead of an antenna there's a foot. And here's proboscipedia, where there is well, that's a normal fly, that's antennapedia. So instead of an antenna, instead of a mouth, you get a foot. Lethal mutation and grotesque, and hard to imagine humans experiencing that, but it was done years later in the XFiles, in the episode called The Postmodern Prometheus. There's a misguided geneticist who wants to apply to humans his experiments with mutant Drosophila with legs as mouth parts. And I'm pretty sure that's the first time the word proboscipedia was pronounced on television. But yeah, so see how horrible it is right there. All right, so more beginning or the end, another wildly inaccurate documentary about the consequences of surviving a nuclear attack. Despite abundant evidence, publicized evidence, these are 40,000 mice being used in atomic tests at Oak Ridge to learn the possible consequences of exposure to radiation on humans. And the mouse on the right is a hereditary mutation, a descendant of mice which have given periodic doses of X-rays, and it's litter mate. So it's not a happy fate for humans. Insects is a somewhat different story. You can't read this slide, but mutation was first studied in insects. Go all the way back to Drosophila. Effects of radiation, first documented in insects. As early as 1919, William P. Davy examined the effects of small doses of X-rays on the confused flower beetle. The little beetles, tiny little beetles that you find sometimes in flour or boxes of cookies that are left on the shelf too long, little tiny guys. And he found that chronic exposure to X-rays seemed to prolong their life, which was pretty much it's buried in the literature. It's not like the public was reading that. And many years succeeded where it was demonstrated by Muller, for example. In one afternoon, you can find more mutations that, induced by X-ray than 40 Sunday afternoons looking for them to happen spontaneously. In the 1950s, with all this atomic weaponry and technology, people were looking for peacetime uses. So X-rays were studied to determine whether they could be used, or atomic radiation could be used for controlling insects, stored product pests. So furniture beetles, flower beetles, flower moths, and the like. In fact, high levels of radiation can kill insects. Early studies with cockroaches, though, at lower levels of radiation suggested that maybe cockroaches couldn't be killed. So this gave rise to that meme that, the last survivors of a thermonuclear war will be cockroaches. The levels they were using back then to test cockroach tolerance were vastly lower than any modern thermonuclear war would be. So rest assured, they would not be the survivors. So in 1957, J.M. Cork repeated Davy's 1919 experiment and found the same result, which was troublesome. And he concluded his paper by saying, it's hoped that the results reported on a simple structure of this kind, the flower beetle, will not be construed as a license for X-ray practitioners to become less critical of recognized safety factors in dealing with the human organism. So does radiation make you stronger and more long-lived? Well, then it happened in 1954. There was a widely publicized accident where a fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon, ironically, sailed through contaminated radioactive cloud that resulted from atomic testing in Bikini Atoll. And it was a newspaper story all over the world. The crew, the boat, and the fish catch were all massively contaminated by fallout. All 23 crewmen suffered severe burns. One died a year later as a result of this contamination. And that, in turn, led to Godzilla. The filmmaker responsible for Godzilla, Ishiro Honda, was inspired to tell a story about the adverse consequences of radiation exposure and created this giant lizard with a radioactive breath. Godzilla was immensely popular, was reshot in English for the US market a couple years later, and Godzilla kept coming back. He always had his atomic breath. But here's Godzilla versus King Kong. And that same year, 1954, was the first mutant giant insect film. It's called Them, exclamation point. Mysterious deaths in a New Mexico town where atomic bombs are being tested. There's some unexplained killings are going on. A peculiar footprint is left behind. Whatever it is breaks in and eats all the sugar in the house. Baffles the local zoologists. They call in USDA myrmecologist and expert Harold Medford and his daughter, and they painstakingly gather evidence to test their hypothesis that these must be ants. When a 12-foot ant walks up behind daughter Pat as she dusts off another footprint. So that pretty much confirmed the theory. So why is this useful? Well, you can use the giant ants, even if radiation makes red flower beetles live longer. It isn't going to make them bigger because insects can't be bigger because of the surface area volume ratio. And that's another whole lecture, but basically life and body size is a story of how surface area can never keep up with volume. Surface area of an organism is a squared value, length times width. Volume is a cubic function, so length times width times height. So as an organism gets bigger, its ratio of surface area to volume keeps dropping. Little organisms have a lot of surface area. Big organisms have a lot of volume. So little organisms are more affected by surface forces than are big organisms. And big organisms are more affected by volume considerations like gravity. That's why, for example, if you tried, if flies can walk on the ceiling. Friction is a surface function, little adhesive pads. Its weight is not very great. Friction keeps it up there. Jeff Goldblum, when he turns into a fly, 6 feet long, could not walk on the ceiling because he has the volume of a human, and therefore he's subject to the laws of physics, just like we all are. So just an example, you can see an organism that's 2 by 2 by 2 has a surface area to volume ratio of 3 to 1. By the time you get to an 8 by 8 by 8, it's down to 3 to 4, so it's less than 1 to 1. So that's one thing. Surface area phenomena affect small organisms like insects. Rates of water loss and gains, rates of heat loss and gain, rates of cellular food acquisition and waste removal, muscle strength. So an ant can lift 10 times its weight, not because its muscles are stronger, but because it's moving, that there's a greater surface area of muscle, which is correlated with strength, moving a particular mass. So the bigger you get, the lower that surface area that is empowering the muscle is to move that weight. So an ant the size of a man could lift the same amount of weight as a man. A grasshopper could, the size of or a flea the size of a human, can jump the equivalent of a football field, but it's not, because if a flea were the size of a human, it would only jump the same distance as a human. So that's not really, and other problems are uniquely insectin. Insects have to molt to get bigger. The bigger you are, the more gravity affects you. When insects shed their skin to get larger, because their exoskeleton doesn't stretch, it takes a while for that exoskeleton to harden. And while it's hardening, if you're big, gravity is weighing down on you, and before it can sclerotize or harden off, it's deformed. So exoskeletal molting doesn't work if you're big. Tracheal respiration constraints. The insects don't breathe the way we do. They don't have a circulating respiratory pigment like hemoglobin that carries oxygen. They have internal tubes that are filled with air that deliver oxygen in air. These internal tubes are lined with that exoskeleton material, and you can't have enough tubes and enough surface area when you're big to deliver oxygen to every cell. The other problem is, too, the high heel problem. If you, you know how you concentrate weight on a high heel, if someone steps on you, it hurts a lot more than it is if it's a big boot. It's because that more weight is being exerted, that pressure is being exerted on a much smaller surface area. Well, if you were a giant insect, the way insect joints work, they're little tiny points. They're little sort of points in hollow rods on which the weight rests. And a big insect, an enormous insect, you would need legs the strength of diamonds in order to avoid buckling when all that weight is concentrated on those 6 points. All right, doesn't matter that it's physically impossible. People loved it. Them got an Academy Award for special effects. One of the few movies we've shown our Insect Fear Film Festival that's an Academy Award winner. And imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and Them was sincerely flattered throughout the 50s. In Them, the FBI agent James Arness says, we haven't seen the end of them. We may have had a close look at the beginning of the end of us, right? So in 1957, Bert I. Gordon ripped off the very statement for his movie, The Beginning of the End, which was about giant grasshoppers induced by radiation. This is Bert I. Gordon, called Mr. Big because his initials are Mr. Big, because most of his movies involved oversized organisms. He was inspired by a grasshopper plague in Texas. His plot relies on the horrific consequences of experimentation with radiation. There's a USDA lab in Rantoul, takes place in Illinois. They're producing giant vegetables to feed a hungry world, and instead grasshoppers get in, eat the giant vegetables, and themselves become giant. They also, radiation renders a laboratory assistant mute. One of my favorite lines from the film is, working with radiation can be dangerous. And the grasshoppers gain access. They escape from where the food is being stored, and then march through, out of Ludlow, through Paxton, the suburbs of Paxton, and then that's what they say in the movie, and then attack Chicago. Okay, where's that needle? Okay, here, spoiler alert. Peter Graves, the scientist who saved Chicago from the Army's solution of dropping an atom bomb on Chicago. Another favorite line of mine is, you can't drop an atom bomb in Chicago. Okay. Lures these grasshoppers into Lake Michigan using sound. And in fact, that is an environmentally compatible control technique. Many of the orthopterans do respond to sound. So there you go. Gordon also made The Amazing Colossal Man about a plane crash, exposure to uranium-enriched rocks. He grows to enormous size. He's disfigured and brain damaged as a result of the exposure. Gordon also made The Amazing Colossal Beast, The War of the Colossal Beast a year later, same plot basically. Yes, radiation exposure causes burns, that's well known. Burns can, the induced mutations, if the burns aren't fatal, can lead to cancers. But typically, exposure to radiation most profoundly affects germ cells. and mutations are then heritable. That's the main issue. And given that the Amazing Colossal Man's fiancée abandons him to his fate at the end of the film without consummating their relationship, that's not an issue in. A Monster from Green Hell. This is the age of the rocket, the jet, atomic power, and man prepares to reach for the star, but before he dares to launch himself into space, there's one great question to be answered. What happens to life in the airless void above Earth's atmosphere? Will life remain untouched, unharmed, or will it change into what? So this is a series of experiments where Quentin Wheeler keeps firing rockets into outer space to get exposed to cosmic radiation. Unreplicated, one example of N of 1 for each species. The consequence of exposing a guinea pig, its coat changes color. A spider crab and an alligator who's been in a trance ever since he got back. Wasps, however, shot into space, come back and turn into giant mutants that land in an African jungle. So the doctor's worried about the consequences. One of the great understatements in cinema. There's a lot of difference between 40 seconds of exposure and 40 hours. So the wasp land in Green Hell, and this high-tech crew launches a 1935 Stanley Livingston era movie trek. It borrowed footage from that film into the heart of darkest Africa to tackle the monster from Green. It's called Monster from Green Hell. There are only really 2 monsters because they only could afford to make 1.5 puppets. Okay, Empire of the Ants. The 70s, the worries were toxic waste. So these are radioactive toxic waste. This is Bird-Eye Gordon again. Unscrupulous real estate dealer, knowing the land was contaminated, trying to sell to visitors this contaminated land. In addition to killing potential homeowners, the giant radiation-induced ants enslaved the local population with pheromones to run the sugar factory in Florida for them. So this is a talking point about pheromones, because where's the sliver here? Here you see Joan Collins, as the unscrupulous real estate developer, being enslaved by the queen ant. This is the ponderous narration here. This is the ant. Treat it with respect. It could very well be the next dominant life form on this planet. Sound incredible? Impossible? Have you ever taken a good close look at what the ant is all about? Like these Athoscephalotes, 15,000 different species inhabiting our planet. Frightening, isn't it? A creature as small as an ant can rank next to man in the scale of intelligence. They have a sophisticated communication system. Specific messages are transmitted from one ant to another through the use of a chemical substance called pheromones. It causes an obligatory response. Did you hear that? Obligatory. Pheromones give an order that cannot be disobeyed. It's a mind-bending substance that forces obedience. Talking point. Ants, yes. Nugget, needle. Ants produce enormous diversity of pheromones. Look at all these glands, all of which produce pheromones. Social insects are full of pheromones. They do use chemical communication. But as this eLife article illustrates, it's not obligatory. It depends on context. It depends on genes. It depends on temperature, pheromone. It depends on food. It depends on age. It depends on condition. So this is another good talking point. In the movie The Bees, actually, pheromones are invoked, and they're called pheromes by the scientists. So there's another talking point that you can actually get the spelling right. And Glass Trap, even as recently as 2005. This is a movie about a ship called the Scarlet Dragon, somehow linked to a terrorist cell in Nevada and a missing stockpile of plutonium from Iraq, ends up transporting trees to Los Angeles, where plutonium has leaked onto them. And they're brought into an office building. Well, they're brought into Los Angeles. They're brought into a garden center, and ants that are exposed become giant. They ultimately end up in an office building. Their explanation to how they became giant so quickly, their rapid life cycle, suggesting a high metabolic rate. With a metabolic rate like that, the effect of radioactivity can be significant. It's like a totally meaningless statement, but again, a good talking point. And yes, ants are among the most successfully invasive species on the planet. Some of our biggest economic problems are indeed invasive ants. They're small. They can get into anything. They do come in on nursery stock. That may be how Solenopsis invicta, the red imported fire ant, ended up in the southeast, or the south and southwest. Yeah, so that's a good talking point for all how ants become invasive and what damage they cause. And a lot of them are in plants there. This is about the only plot point, however, although there is a reference to formic acid. When ants, even in them, the place smelled like formic acid. I'm not sure here if anyone would be able to identify that, but it's a key plot point. I found traces, significant traces of formic acid. Formic acid is not a naturally occurring element in the human body. It's an active ingredient in the saliva of the Camphinotus obscura peas. Your victims were eaten by ants. Not in the saliva, but close. I do like their explanation, their speculation about how they got so large. The unscientific one was, maybe they work out? Great. All right. So are we done with this? Have we become so sophisticated now that we no longer find adventures into the unknown, visualizing unknown, entertaining enough so that we can tap into that entertainment value to present people with the actual science? Don't bet on it. If you want to bet, this recent news story released just last month, researchers at Rockefeller University have used CRISPR, which is a gene editing technique. So it's not, it basically is a form of mutation in that it goes to the germline and it permanently transforms a heritable trait by sort of snipping it out. And this CRISPR study was used to knock out or eliminate the activity of an odorant receptor that is necessary for ants to perceive just about any kind of odor. There are two types of odorant receptors. One is this highly conserved basically across all insects. It's called orco, and it's kind of an empty sort of partner gene that makes the other gene work. And the other genes, the odorant receptors, are enormously diverse and reflect the ecology of the organism, specific receptors for specific key signaling substances, such as, for example, formic acid, or all those pheromones. So investigators at Rockefeller could knock it out and render them unable to smell. So you can genetically alter ants. Okay, there's a screenplay in there somewhere, and we will see it. And when we see it, we will show it at the Insect Beer Film Festival, and you can use it in your classrooms. Thank you, that's all. And yeah, I can take some questions. The lights are here. Is this it? Nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. That's it. The third option. All right.
So I noticed the Rotten Tomatoes numbers on a lot of those movies very low. So does that mean box office? But that doesn't mean box office.
Not at all.
So,
nope.
So lots of people don't care.
Yeah,
about
it is amazing what
the ratings.
Yeah.
I just want to see that.
Yeah. These are not. That's why I said there is another Academy Award winning movie, one for best costumes. It was not the typical science fiction film. But no, you will not see this kind of science fiction winning Academy Awards, but just fine. It's amazing what gets released. We saw a movie, we actually bought, believe it or not, a movie called Tsunami. Okay, and this was a movie that was, I think it was made in Colorado by the writer, director, producer, one guy. And it, as far as I could tell, had nothing to do with tsunamis or bees. They were angry hornets, and it was some sort of gravitational wave rather than a a tsunami sort of thing. We watched it, you can find it on Rotten Tomatoes. Where's this needle? Is there a sliver? I mean, these were not even bees. They nested in hornet nests. You know, bees live in cavities. These live in those giant nests that everybody seems to think is what a beehive looks like, even though they know it's not what a beehive. You know, the big sort of gray paper, that's hornets, not bees. Even in the bee movie, we had Simon Smith, the director there, and I had to ask him, you know, in the bee movie, where some aspects of bee biology are correct, they had these, come on, you know enough about bees, you know those are not beehives. And he explained that it's not visual. You know, they live inside a tree. How are you going to depict that? So it's an icon. You put them hanging from a branch. So where is the needle in tsunami? You know, where is that sliver you can use to teach from? Well, there are examples of weather events leading to the mysterious transport of organisms over great distances. There's a phenomenon called spider rain, where there are tornadic spouts that pick up spiders and move them, and then hundreds of miles away they get deposited. Perhaps the most creative elaboration of this concept is Sharknado, and it's for sequels. I don't know if I can get them all. Sharknado, oh hell no. Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens, and God, what was the fifth one? Was about it was about climate change. It was a really great pun. Usually, that's where the creativity all goes into the title. Anyway, oh, Tsunami, by the way, premiered at Cannes. Apparently, there's this little-known secret, that, like in the basement or something of a building. Bad movies get premiered at Cannes as well. So they look for distributors. So, that was a long answer to. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, the nice thing too is that they're available. It used to be really hard to find some of these movies, more obscure movies. And now you can get them streaming. You can get them, you know, on DVD. So you don't have to wait for them to come to your local Cineplex, because they won't. But anyway, if that's go ahead.
There are consulting scientists on some of these, aren't there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but not on these movies.
Well, sometimes. Yeah. The Science and Entertainment Exchange is an operation run by the National Academy of Sciences that partners genuine scientists with Hollywood writers, producers, anyone in the entertainment industry who wants more credible science. And everyone, I'm a member of the board, and every scientist who's on the Science and Entertainment Exchange board, and it includes producers. Seth MacFarlane actually is on the board. All kinds of, you know, scientists and entertainment industry types. The scientists are all told that, you know, the cardinal rule, the central dogma, if you will, is the story is paramount. They will ignore you if it's inconvenient to the story. And that's fine, because that's not their job, is to teach science. That's our job. I'm also on a National Academy committee called Keck Science Communication Awards, which gives prizes for science communication. It's a prize for a newspaper, a prize for movies and TV, a prize for books. This year, Hidden Figures was nominated in 2 categories, book and movie. And it won the book award, very inspiring, and science was great. There was a big argument on the committee about the movie award because, as is always done, liberties were taken with the scientific story. You know, the scientific story involved hundreds of people, and you can't make a movie about hundreds of people. Scientific story was not that dramatic. That's the problem. A lot of science isn't very cinematic. Anyone see the movie? You know where Kevin Costner comes in with a sledgehammer and knocks down the sign that says "for colors only"? That never happened. Basically, she just ignored the sign and went in. And there was no dramatic moment. But you can't have a movie without dramatic moments. So part of our committee, really annoyed that this remarkable, you know, the story of the remarkable woman was set aside for a heroic white guy to come and save her. And the fact that many important people were omitted and some of the scientific details were glossed over. But then the other group was arguing there would have been no one would have known about the book had there not been a movie. The rights were bought up really early, actually before it actually had been published. So they got the book award, and the movie is mentioned in the book award, but the committee could not bring itself to reward for science communication a movie that took liberties with the actual science process. Yes?
Aside from the sort of Hollywood films, and thank you for that talk, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm in the media and cinema studies department, so of course this sort of thing appeals to me broadly. One of my colleagues, Julie Turnoff, specifically on science fiction and sort of science fiction and special effects, and this is right up her alley. But I was thinking a little bit about, besides thinking about Hollywood as sort of like an institution far away from many educational institutions, obviously, unless you're looking on the West Coast, I was trying to think about other kinds of spaces for science-based communications that local campuses can take advantage of. And I think a little bit about the example, for instance, of Stephen Jay Gould and the way that the Harvard's Natural History Museum was really used as a kind of channel as well with his directorship. Then to think about science communication and biological communication and evolutionary communication, that sort of thing. And I think then about our own local ecology here in Urbana-Champaign, and I wondered if you could just mention any kinds of local projects that you think of as really nice models for thinking through science-based communication. And I'll just mention one event as well that might be of interest to people in the room, which is an event that's being organized in November around speculative fictions. That's between a collaboration between the IPRH Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities, the CSL Coordinated Science Lab, Beckman, and the NCSA, which is themed around speculative fiction. So we'll bring in and draw in science fiction authors and artists across different kinds of media formats. So film, literature, music, and graphic arts. So, but in any case, I wondered if you could just underscore for us some of the local projects that you see here.
Well, are you new in town?
Well, we've been here for a while.
So you don't know about the Insect Fear Film Festival? Yeah, we are, next February will be our 35th year, and it started in 1984, and the whole point was to show bad science fiction films, then explain to people why what they're about to see can't possibly happen, and then introduce people to the actual, quote, stars of the film. So we've been doing that for 35 years. My colleague just Wednesday night did a science cafe on insects, did it first, bioinspiration. All kinds of amazing adaptations that humans are now exploiting to develop new technology. So the science cafes are good. We had an amazing March for Science in our town. We proportionately had more people attending than the one in Chicago did. Less press attention, but it was a remarkable show of support for science. Our local museums, too, are deeply involved in science communication. Our citizen science project with Misty, the bee spotter, is a way to get people involved, as is the Pollinatarium. I don't know if you've been there. This is a building that used to be a pesticide storage shed that was converted to a bee lab, and then when a better bee lab was built, converted in 2009 to a science center because our Natural History Museum closed down when NHB started falling apart. And there was no public face for science, so you can go to the Pollinatarium.
I don't think there's another town within the science group that the farmers market.
Yeah. Well, that's, the farmers market has science. The physics van is another one.
No, we have a science booth.
Right, but there's also the physics van, right?
There is also
Yeah. Yeah. So we're full of science communication. There was an informal survey that was done by an entomologist in Mexico, ranking cities on their insect savviness. And guess which metropolitan area came out #1? And he never published it. It was really disappointing. I'd love to show that to the chancellor sometime. So. Anyway, I have another meeting.
Wait, who was the number one?
We were number one. Except it's not published, so it doesn't exist. So. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.